Reflection, A Twisted Tale by Elizabeth Lim. Chapter 1. They only had one cannon left. Mulan held her breath, digging her heels deep into the snow as she surveyed the valley ahead for any sign of the Huns. Nothing. From the heights above where, only minutes ago, a barrage of army arrows had rained down death upon them. Also nothing. All was still. Too still. Mulan knew better than to hope the silence meant the Huns had retreated. No, with each passing second her apprehension grew. None of the soldiers beside her, Yao or Ling or Qianpo, or even her dragon guardian Mushu, said a word. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Her eyes focused on a plume of smoke circling across the top of the hill, moving like a dark and foreboding shadow. As it thinned into the air, Mulan's brow furrowed. There was something behind the smoke. No, someone. Dread twisted in her gut. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the imposing form mounted on a black horse. Shang Yu. The smoke lifted, revealing an endless line of Han soldiers on horseback, rimming the hills and blocking their way. They were surrounded. There were barely 10 men left in the Captain Li Shang's regiment against an overwhelming force of Huns, and the Huns had the advantage of attacking from above. Mulan knew what everyone must be thinking. How could they possibly survive? Captain Li Shang tightened the collar of his red cape, then turned to face his soldiers. His expression was grim, but resolute. "Prepare to fight," he said. "If we die, we die with honor." Her pulse pounding in her ears, Mulan clenched her fist and sucked in the cold, cold air. She didn't know whether her knees were buckling from fear or from hopelessness, or both. She didn't want to be afraid. There was no dignity in fear. But there was no hope. After all, what could she do? It was clear Shang believed they could only stand their ground and fight. Still, she drew her sword with hesitation. There had to be another way. With a ferocious battle cry, Shang Yu led the charge to war. His steed raced down the snow-capped slope, followed by his men. The sound of the horses thundering down the hill was a terrible counterpoint to Mulan's racing heart. She squeezed the hilt of her sword, trying to tune out the sound, but it was impossible. Her eyes froze in the storm of white cascading over the Huns as they ripped across the snow. "Yao," Shang said calmly. "Aim the cannon at Shang Yu." More like a firecracker than a cannon, Mulan thought, glumly. Too small to rest all her hopes on. It was barely larger than her torso, with a red dragon's head at the tip. Yao, the shortish soldier, swung the cannon left and right, trying to find the best position to fire at Shan Yu. She frowned. Eliminating their leader would likely throw the Huns into disarray and slow their invasion, but even if they killed Shang Yu, the rest of the Hun army could slaughter them. She forced her focus ahead, knowing she needed to prepare herself mentally for battle, but she couldn't take her mind off Shang's command to Yao. Something about it felt wrong. Her sword weighed heavy in her hand. She stared at the polished blade, wondering if its reflection would be the last sight she ever caught of herself. Would she die as Ping, the Fa Sung she'd made up so she could join the army in her father's place? If she died here, in the middle of this snow-covered mountain pass, she'd never see her father or her family again. Mulan swallowed hard. Who would believe that only a few months ago her biggest concern had been impressing the matchmaker? She could barely remember the girl she'd been back then. She'd worn layer upon layer of silk, not plates of armor. Her waist cinched tight in a satin sash instead of sore from carrying a belt of weapons. Her lips had been painted with rouge instead of chapped from cold and lack of water. Her lashes highlighted with kohl that she now could only dream of using to fuel a fire for warmth. How far she'd come from that girl to who she was now, a soldier in the Imperial Army. Maybe serving her country as a warrior was truer to her heart than being a bride. Yet, when she saw her reflection in her sword, she knew that she was still pretending to be someone else. She'd never have a chance to find out who that person was, because she, Mulan, was about to die. And the one thing she regretted most was that she'd never make her family proud of her. The Huns drew closer. As Mulan raised her sword higher, a flash on the blade caught her eye again. Not her reflection this time, but that of a snowy overhang on a peak behind the Huns. Her thoughts quickened as she tilted the blade from side to side, then glanced back up, taking in the massive snow embankment. She had an idea. It was crazy, and it would mean disobeying Shang's order. But if it worked... Mulan's heart raced with a sudden burst of hope. What was there to lose? If she didn't try, they'll all die. Even if her plan succeeded, they likely wouldn't survive. But China. She could save China from the Huns. No time for second thoughts. Mulan sheathed her sword and lunged forward, grabbing the cannon from Yao. "Hey!" he shouted after her. But Mulan was already racing toward the Huns. It was the boldest, wildest thing she's ever done. She tucked the cannon under her arm, barely noticing as Mushu grabbed hold of her scarf so he could keep up. Up the hill she ran, and with each step she grew more determined and less afraid. Behind, Shang shouted after her, "Ping! Come back! Ping!" She ignored him. The Huns were descending fast. She only had moments before Shan Yu was upon her, and his army crushed what was left of Shang's troops. Mulan stopped and planted the cannon into the snow, aiming it at the overhang, praying she had picked a good spot. This could work, if Shan Yu didn't kill her first. He was so close she could smell his horse's sweat, so close she could see his black eyes glaring at her. Her blood thundered in her ears. Distantly she could hear Mushu telling her to hurry. She fumbled in her pocket for the pieces of flint and frantically tried to light the cannon's fuse. She didn't see Shan Yu's falcon soaring overhead. It swooped down, its powerful wings knocking her back into the snow and scattering the flint rocks behind her. Mulan jolted up. No, 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 she thought as she swept the snow for the flint. She couldn't find it. She looked up. Shan Yu was charging straight for her. She grabbed Mushu by the neck, squeezing until he choked a breath of fire. It was just enough to light the cannon. Sulfur burned into the air. Mulan crouched, holding the weapon steady as it shot itself toward the overhang. Shan Yu's horse reared from the cannon's explosion, but Mulan was barely aware of the Hun leader. Her gaze was locked on the overhang, and on the rocket arching smoothly toward it until it finally lodged itself into the snow. A loud rumble erupted. Snow plummeted off the pier piece, crashing, washing down into the pass in fearsome white sheets, an avalanche. Mulan grinned. She'd done it. She stumbled, struggling to keep upright as the ground shook. She needed to get back to the others. Suddenly, Shan Yu loomed above, and her grin faltered. Up close, he was like a mountain himself, broad and large, his fists alone the size of Mulan's head. Shan Yu's deep-set eyes narrowed with rage, and he lifted his sword with one powerful arm, ready to deliver her a crushing blow. "Ping!" Shang shouted from behind. Before she could draw her sword to try to defend himself, Shan Yu let out a furious cry and swung his blade. Mulan braced herself for the blow. It never came. Shang shoved her out of the way. It happened so fast. Before Mulan even tumbled into the snow, she heard a rush of wind and the swipe of Shan Yu's blade. Then, a low, pained grunt. "No!" Mulan cried, lifting her head and pushing herself up. "Shang!" The captain's red cape fluttered behind him, caught in the wind. For a moment she couldn't see him, and she thought maybe it was the Hun's leader's grunt she had heard. Maybe Shang had defeated him. Then Shang's cape settled, sweeping over his back as before, and any hope Mulan had died. She saw he was hurt, too, hurt to even lift his sword. It fell from his hand into the snow with a thump. Shang staggered back, his boots grinding into the snow. He raised his fists, not about to give up. "Is this the best China has to offer?" Shang Yu said, laughing. "Go, Ping," Shang rasped, as Mulan raced to help him. "Go." She wasn't fast enough. With one swift punch, Shan Yu knocked Shang off his feet, and the captain collapsed.